How crucial was the concept of Eurafrica to the Treaty of Rome in 1957?
Well, Eurafrica was one of the central components of the Treaty of Rome, and it was also one of the issues that was dealt with at most length. And it was central in the sense that France had made it very clear in the beginning of the negotiations that it could not participate in a scheme such as the EEC without having its colonies being incorporated in one way or the other. And a central misconception about this association regime that became the result is that all the other countries, with the possible exception of Belgium, were against France's ultimate, or the French idea, but they went along in order not to derail the treaty. But that's not true. If you look at the negotiations for the Treaty of Rome, you will soon realize that there was widespread consensus, especially not least from West Germany and Konrad Adenauer, who were very, very much friends of Eurafrica, due to economic interest, not least, seeing great business opportunities and from French colonies and all the resources, not least oil and gas that were found in Algeria in big measures in 1956, but also for political and geopolitical reasons.
How does their colonial relationships in the region influence the current European perception of Africa?
Yeah, well, you could say that the concrete form of Eurafrica as a colonial association regime in the Treaty of Rome, that is still very much visible. If you know the history of Eurafrica, you also can see its imprint on today's EU-African relations, not least when it comes to trade, aid, but also the strategic and geopolitical issues, where France again is always leading, but initiator, and then at the same time wanting European support for its mission. The migration issue is of course absolutely central here, because there's a lot of EU cooperation with countries in Africa, both multilateral and bilateral, but the EU has a clear conception of African countries as partners as oftentimes as buffer zones to stop and to prevent further migration and refugee migration to the EU.
Eurafrica is largely unknown today. Does that mean that it failed as a concept?
No, that's one of the big points we make in our book. Quite the contrary, Eurafrica succeeded while at the same time being forgotten, and that can be hard to understand. But we can say that we use the concept of Eurafrica as a vanishing mediator, meaning that it mediated in order to vanish, or once it had mediated between two, what is now perceived as two separate, or a rupture in history between colonialism and decolonization, or colonial exploitation and development and aid, the bad and the good. Eurafrica was the project that managed to, on the one hand, change the language from colonialism to post-colonial decolonization, development, and so on, so that we tend to perceive of decolonization as a rupture. But what Eurafrica then succeeded in was to keep the structural level, not totally, but intact to a large extent, meaning that African dependence on Europe, even then as independent countries would continue, and that European countries had a huge leverage in their former colonies. The EEC, not the least, which then agreed new agreements with African countries, the Yaoundé, the Lomé, and now the Cotonou agreements, that all have their basis in the first colonial association.